I'm Lucy Beatrix. I'm a former fashion model turned competitive runner. And if I could go back in time over a decade and tell my 20-year-old self what I know now, what would that be? Great question. I have been thinking about this for the past day or two of what would I have told little 20-year-old Lucy who was here living in New York City as a fashion model under contract with one of the best modeling agencies in the world. And when I really think about it, it's kind of surprising what I've come up with. So let's get into it. But before I do, I want to share with you an article that I recently wrote for this magazine, Like the Wind. And it's a running magazine, but in this piece, I share my story from fashion model to runner. The piece is called A Body in Motion, where I talk about how I ran away from my life as a fashion model to become the competitive runner that I am now. And I really like this piece because it was something that really came from the heart, where I told the story of what it was like a day in the life as a model back in the day versus what it's like now. And I think the biggest takeaway from this piece for Like the Wind was that I expressed how I was determined to break away from this life of superficiality, which was my life when I was just another pretty face as a fashion model. So if you have a chance and you can get access to this magazine, I'll leave a link in the show notes below. But I feel like this really came from the heart, and I want to share that with you guys in case you want to read a little bit more about in depth what it was like a day in the life as a fashion model versus my very healthy, athletic focused life now. So yeah, that said, what would I tell young Lucy knowing what I know now? When I really think about it, a couple things come to mind. Back when I was 20 and I was living here in New York City, I was living completely alone in a tiny studio in Chelsea, Manhattan. And my entire world was the fashion industry. I was working under Ford Models, which if you don't know, is one of the best modeling agencies that you could be with. They just represented the best models, got their girls the best jobs. And I was working like crazy. I'd already landed the cover of Elle magazine. I'd already been on the cover of several international magazines. And so my career was definitely on the up. And the interesting aspect of that was that unlike all the other 20-year-olds that I knew from my hometown in St. Louis, I was working full time. Whereas a lot of my peers that I grew up with were in college and exploring and getting to know who they were and what they wanted to be. I feel like I had a lot of pressure to have this job that I had a contract with, and just a lot of stress surrounding work as a 20-year-old. And I think if I could go back, I would have found ways to take a little bit of the stress off and maybe not have made modeling my entire life. But so more specifically, I think the number one thing that I would say, or the first thing that I'm going to share of what I would have told my 20-year-old self, I would have taken her by the shoulders and said, Lucy, make sure you've got good people in your life. Surround yourself with a positive community. And I think I tried to do this by going to the local yoga studio and hanging out and getting to know people there, or just hanging around cool places and trying to get to know the people at the coffee shops. But I think I would have surrounded myself with more people in general of all different kinds of professions, and not just been so singularly focused on the fashion world. Because as you know, or as you can imagine, the fashion industry is kind of a strange place to grow up. And while I'm grateful that I grew up in the fashion industry or came into my own in the fashion industry, I think I would have surrounded myself with a more eclectic group of people back then in order to get to where I wanted to go now. Okay, so that said, having surrounding myself with a different group of people, or a more diverse group of people working in all different kinds of industries, I think that would have given me a better perspective of where I was in my life. So when I was 20, I feel like because I had all this pressure, I also felt like I had to have it all figured out and all perfect and be able to support myself 100%, living in one of the most expensive cities in the world. And I think that like stepping out of that, I think it would have made more sense for me to have downsized and maybe lived with roommates or lived in Brooklyn instead of Manhattan, or taken maybe a more frugal route as far as having my overhead be a little bit lower so that there wasn't this extreme amount of pressure and stress to support myself. And while I ultimately think that having that pressure of having my own place in Chelsea and having this contract was really good because it really pushed me to work harder and get those gigs as a model, I think if I had had less pressure, I might have been able to enjoy the experience a little bit more. So I think the second thing that I would have told my 20-year-old self is to think about how to be more frugal of having roommates or living maybe not in the middle of Manhattan, or just finding ways to maybe cut down on costs overall so that I could enjoy the New York City life a little bit more instead of sitting there wondering if I'm going to make my rent every month. But that said, the third thing that I would say is I would have told 20-year-old Lucy to get on top of her health. And what I mean by that is, as of now, in my 30s, I feel like I'm the most healthy that I've ever been. I eat a whole food diet. I train really hard. I focus a lot on my recovery and my sleep. And I would have told 20-year-old Lucy that you're not going to get away with the lifestyle that you're starting to have. And what I mean by that is I kind of thought that I could cut corners on eating, and like I was just kind of eating whatever. At that point I hadn't really gotten to know what is right for my body and what's going to make me feel like I have energy after I eat versus bogging me down. So I would have maybe jump started that exploration into healthy eating a little bit sooner. But that said, I think that ultimately the road did lead me to that. Like I did need to, I hit a wall. I needed to learn how to eat healthy and fuel my body properly in order to find out that I was an athlete underneath all of that. But yeah, I think it would have helped to figure that out a little bit sooner. And that leads me to the fourth thing that I would have told myself, which is substances, whether that's cigarettes, alcohol, whatever else, they're not going to make you better than you started. They might be fun in the moment, but they definitely, my relationship with substances is tricky. I definitely have explored and had my fun with all of that stuff, but I think I would have told 20-year-old Lucy to keep that in check or be very mindful of what all of that entails and how it's kind of like, it's a little bit of a gamble. And what I mean by that is that I'm not upset that I went on to have these experiences with like substances and understanding my relationship with substance. But I think that if I had known how far that would go, I would have maybe changed how I approach drinking or smoking cigarettes and all that stuff. Because ultimately, I got healthy and I'm the runner that I am now, running fast and far. So it all worked out. But I think maybe I would have been a little bit faster. And who even knows if I had never gone on a detour in my 20s with alcohol and the like. So the next thing I would tell myself after telling young Lucy to be more frugal, get on top of my health, don't surround yourself with people who are maybe just in one industry, as well as not getting detoured by substances like alcohol or smoking cigarettes. I would tell her probably the most important thing, which is why it's last, which is nothing really matters. And what I mean by that is don't sweat the small stuff, little Lucy. Just enjoy life. Yes, you might have a big bill come in or a breakup or, things happen that are not the best, but, or like things that seem like an immediate problem. But I think overall, when I look back at the things that bothered me throughout my 20s or things I got really upset about and was just had sleepless nights, I look at that and I think nothing was ever as bad in hindsight as it actually was or how it felt in the moment. And I think that it would be really important for me to have known back then that life just keeps going on. And a lot of really big, hard things happened in my 20s that I could never have anticipated when I was 20 years old. Like when I was 27, my dad suddenly dying in his 50s out of nowhere. I would have never expected that to happen, but life kept going. And I learned how to pick myself up and keep persisting. And if anything, stumbling upon the running later into my 20s just showed me what I believe now going into my 30s and 40s or the next couple decades is that you never know what's going to happen. Things could completely change. You have the potential to rewrite your narrative. And so that's why I would have told me back then over a decade ago to just don't sweat it and don't get carried away. Like, yes, it's good to plan and have an idea of what you want to do, but I think it's more important to chase goals and dreams and think about what you want in your future than to worry about little stuff happening day to day. So yeah, I think that that's pretty much what I would have told my 20-year-old self. And I don't know if it would have landed with her, but I do think that it has, even just reflecting, thinking about what I would have told my 20-year-old self, leaves me wondering what my 40-year-old self is going to tell my 30-year-old self, and so on and so on. So I think it kind of gives me perspective of what my future self will tell me now, and I'm going to try to take that advice before it even happens. So yeah, until next time, just be fast. Just win.